Welcome. We're going to start our webinar now. Welcome to our Progress Center webinar, Special Education Preparation, Promising Strategies to Promote Recruitment and Retention. So as you can see here, we have a high-level agenda and we have a lot of rich content packed in the next 2 hours. So we'll not have a lot of time for breakout sessions. There will actually be no breakout sessions. You will have an opportunity to engage in the chat box. And there will also be a link for a Jamboard discussion. So please use this Jamboard throughout all of the presentations to reflect and make connections with each presenter. A couple of webinar objectives. During this event, presenters will share recent research about recruitment, preparation, and retention of special education teachers, a Georgia partnership and guidance promoting recruitment, preparation, and retention for educators supporting students with disabilities, practice-based resources to build the knowledge and capacity of special educators developing and implementing high-quality educational programming. So now I'd like to introduce Drs. Tessie Bailey and David Emenheiser. Dr. Tessie Bailey is our Progress Center Project Director, and Dr. David Emenheiser is our Progress Center Project Officer. So I'd now like to pass this to Tessie Bailey.
All right, thank you, Stacy. I am pleased to represent the Progress Center, and I just want to share, one of the main questions that we've been trying to answer through the course of our 5-year funded center is, how do we ensure that every student is on the path to progress? And so if on our next slide, you'll sort of see our big bucket of scope of work, and I'll explain how this fits in here. Our center is primarily focused on providing information, resources, tools, and technical assistance to local educators. It's a little bit different than some of the other federally funded programs, but our focus is primarily on helping local educators in the development and implementation of high quality educational programming. Part of that is through the IEP, but it's also through, access to rich Tier 1 instruction within the school system. Our work that we're going to be talking about today falls under our knowledge development strand, and that's really around helping us understand what is in the research world that can really help us in our practice at the local level. Stacy is leading that work, and so I appreciate her moderating today's session. The other things that we do is we provide technical assistance to local educators through partnership sites, and we have about 11 of those that are across the country and in the Pacific Islands that are helping us field test some of this work to move research to practice. And finally, Amy Peterson, who will help with the closing of today, oversees our technical assistance and helps with the release of the tools and resources. So part of this work today is to help us understand what's needed in the field to help really promote progress at the local level. We have been focusing on identifying the essential elements of a sustainable ecosystem. It's ultimately thinking about what's necessary for success within a school system. A lot of our initial work was around the IEP, which we've illustrated here as a bike. And we understand that the IEP itself really outlines the components of the individualized education program for that student. But we've also learned through our work that IEP is only successful if it exists within a sustainable ecosystem. You can see the boxes that are here that really illustrate those essential elements. And today's work really falls under what we see as educator support. Ultimately, the success of a student is dependent on the fact that they get a teacher who has the knowledge and skills and capacity to help design and implement that high quality educational programming. So I'm pleased to welcome all of you here to hear from the researchers and state level practitioners about how they are addressing sort of these challenges that we're having in identifying and retaining high quality education, special educators. And I'm going to pass this to Dr. Emenheiser, who's been instrumental in helping us sort of conceptualize this work through the Progress Center over the last 4 years.
Thank you, Tessie and Stacy. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be the project officer for this center. one of the things that we talked about very early on was to not have any assumptions about the work. There are a lot of assumptions about what happens in special ed and what's working and what's not working. And we decided to kind of put some of those assumptions aside and really get to the facts of what was happening and what was working. And that worked really well for this center because just 6 months after it was funded, the COVID shutdown occurred and sort of changed the landscape a little bit of special education. And I think especially related to this topic where we're talking about preparation, recruitment, retention of personnel in special ed, because it seems that the workforce, the workplace is very different now than it once was. So really looking forward to today to be able to look at what we're hearing, what we're learning from the people who are actually doing the work, not some talking head like maybe I am. So I just am thankful that you've joined us today and that you're participating in this webinar. And with that, I'm just going to turn it back over, I think, to Stacy. Thank you
Yes.
again.
Thank you, David. So for the first hour, we will share special education preparation recent research. And as I shared, you'll have the opportunity to use a Jamboard link. I'm going to drop it in the chat here. And if that, that didn't go, I will drop it once I pass it to Roddy. Here, there's just 2 key points. We want to hear from you what's going on in your district, your state, and at your university. And those are what barriers and challenges are you encountering, and what strategies and solutions are you using? So throughout all the presentations today, please use the Jamboard link to make these connections and note your local, state, national, and university level challenges and solutions. So with that, I'd like to now introduce our presenters. So this is our first stack of powerhouse presenters, Dr. Roddy Theobald, Allison, Elizabeth, and Melinda. So first up, Roddy Theobald, he's a managing researcher at AAR and also the deputy director of Calder. Next, you'll hear from Dr. Allison Gilmer. She is a principal researcher at AAR. Next, Dr. Elizabeth Bettini. She's an associate professor at Boston University. And last, we'll close out the first session with Dr. Melinda Lecco. She's a professor at the University of Florida and co-director of the Cedar Center. So now I'm going to hand it off to Roddy.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. My name is Roddy Theobald. I work in Calder, which is the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research at AAR. I'm out in Seattle, Washington. And for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to be sharing some research from 3 states, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Hawaii. I saw in the introductions that we have at least 1 person from Washington, so welcome. I'd love to see in the chat if any of you who have joined a little bit later are from one of these 3 states, because I think this research is particularly relevant for you, but hopefully speaks to challenges we're facing across the country. I'd like to acknowledge that a great deal of this research was funded by a grant from IES, the National Center for Special Education Research. I'd like to thank them for that funding. So just to start off as provocative a point as I possibly can, I've got a subtitle for this research talk that I think reflects a lot of what we're finding. The subtitle is as follows: do we really have a special education teacher shortage? Or do we have a shortage of special education teachers who are still teaching special education? The reason I bring this up is because a lot of it's relevant for a lot of the findings from these 3 states. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to share some data from Washington. These data are old, but they have the sheen of academic publications, so we'll go with them for now. These are data about teachers in Washington state. On the x-axis here, we have different school years from 5 to 12 years ago. And the first bar here is the number of teachers who are teaching in Washington state schools who have an endorsement to teach special education. These are teachers who are eligible to teach special education in the state. And then the second set of bars are the teachers who are actually teaching special education. The difference between these bars are teachers who have an endorsement to teach special education, but for whatever reason are not currently teaching special education. They're teaching in another setting in schools. We think this is important because clearly special education teacher attrition is a problem. But even what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the gray bar here is the number of teachers who left the workforce at the end of these years. Even with high special education teacher attrition, if you look at the difference between these bars, there are plenty of teachers already in public schools in Washington who are eligible to teach in special education positions, more than enough to replace teachers who are leaving these positions. But year after year, that's not happening. So we might ask ourselves why this is the case. And the reason we know that this is the case is because by every measure of shortages I have ever encountered, there's clearly a widespread special education teacher shortage in the state. I'll just share one opposite end of the spectrum, very recent data point. This is data from the last 2 years. What we've been doing is collecting data automatically, downloading from district hiring websites in Washington. We've been looking at the types of jobs that districts are trying to hire in the state and comparing them to the number of teachers currently in the district to try to get at, current demand for teachers in different subjects. So from winter of 2022 through winter of the most recent school year, these are the number of postings for different subject areas scaled by the number of teachers currently teaching those subjects. And in every one of these 5 quarters, special education is the area with the highest demand in the state. So part of this talk is how do we reconcile the fact that, there's clearly enough individuals in schools to teach these positions with the reality that districts are having a lot of trouble hiring for these positions. And what I want to do is provide just a very high level overview of a couple papers that try to get at the sources of special education teacher shortages. And I say sources and not causes. This slide gives you absolutely no indication of how you might solve these problems. These are all just descriptively true facts about the special education teacher labor market in Washington and Pennsylvania. The first fact is that over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been sharp declines in the number of individuals graduating from special education programs. So you might think of this as the supply of potential special education teachers has been decreasing. The second fact is that there's, to my eye, a surprisingly high proportion of candidates who get a credential to teach who just never do. It's about 2/3 of candidates who get a teaching credential in Washington eventually teach in the state. So you might wonder what's happening to the other third. We don't know much about that, but it's certainly a source of shortages. A third fact is that specific to special education, there's a very high proportion of graduates of special education teacher education programs who get a dual license in special education and another subject who never enter a special education position. They immediately enter a general education position, even though they have a credential to teach special education. The fourth fact is well documented. Attrition in special education is higher than other subjects, so we need to replace more special education teachers every year proportionally than other subjects. And then finally, in the first 5 years of a teacher's career, we see a lot of movement out of special education positions and into general education positions, particularly for teachers who have a dual endorsement to teach both special education and another subject. So put together, we argue that these are 5 important sources of special education teacher shortages. I'm hoping to transition to some potential solutions, but before I do, I wanted to pose a question in the chat, kind of the canonical APR question as you're thinking about the special education teacher pipeline in your setting. I'm sure these are all challenges, but what do you think is the single biggest challenge? Feel free to give a one-word answer in the chat. Is it about attracting individuals to pursue a career? Is it about preparing those individuals to be successful in the classroom? Or is it about retaining special educators in the workforce and in special education positions? All right. My extremely rough mental math here is that we're roughly split between attracting and retaining. No votes for preparing yet, but I'll still give a nod to it since it's the title of our session today. And I want to walk through three different examples, one from each state, of state efforts to address these challenges and the emerging research evidence around those efforts. The first of these efforts were the state evaluator for Pennsylvania's Attract, Prepare, and Retain initiatives. There's several initiatives that go along with this program, but one of them is associated with their Attract efforts. The state is giving grants called Developing Future Special Educators grants. They're grants to districts and institutes of higher education to develop and implement experiential learning opportunities to get students interested in a future career in special education. Now, last year was the first year of this, and I'm very much playing the long game with this because I would love to follow these people over time and see who actually does become a special education teacher someday. What I can tell you now is, as part of our year one evaluation, we just asked students, these are mostly high school students, before and after participating in this, do you have an interest in pursuing career special education? After participating, almost half of students who participated in these programs said they have an interest in a career in special education, which is significantly higher than before the intervention. So I think this is a novel attempt to get out in front of future challenges with the supply side of the special education teacher pipeline and attract greater interest in the profession. A second example is kind of loosely related to preparation, in the sense that we have this paper documenting one of the phenomenons that I talked about as a source of special education teacher shortages, which is that there's a lot of teachers who never enter the workforce in the first place, and particularly for dual endorsed candidates, a lot of teachers who leave special education positions and move into general education positions. What we did is we followed a cohort of graduates from special education teacher ed programs in Washington. If everyone became a special education teacher and stayed in the workforce, the line would stay at 100% as I go along the first, second, third, and fourth year in the workforce. What we see instead is looking at two different groups. There's a group of teachers who only got a special ed endorsement, and then a group of teachers who are dual endorsed in special education and another subject. This is showing the proportion of those teachers who enter the workforce at all and then stay in the workforce after their first 4 years. So for both groups, after 4 years, roughly 70 to 75% of these teachers are still teaching at all. What's really striking is when you do the same things for entering and staying in special education positions, you see some very big differences. I'm going to highlight this dashed line, which is for dual endorsed candidates, their likelihood of being in a special education position. Only about 2/3 of those candidates enter a special education position at all. And by 4 years in, less than half of them are still teaching special education. So in discussions with the Department of Ed, there was some real concern around a recent policy that required a dual endorsement for all candidates, with the concern that this could have the unintended consequence of leading to more teachers leaving special education positions. And they, in fact, got rid of that policy 2 years ago, partly in response to this, also in response to other concerns from other stakeholders in the state. So that's the second point related to preparation. The third point I want to make is from Hawaii. I mentioned Hawaii earlier. This is hot off the presses, a brand new paper with some of my colleagues who are part of this session today about an innovative retention policy in Hawaii that provides bonuses to special education teachers. So historically, what I'm showing you here is in Hawaii, what proportion of positions in the state are either entirely vacant or filled by an unlicensed teacher. The blue dots are positions that are not in special education. The red dots are the positions in special education. Clearly, there's much greater shortages by this measure in special education positions historically. In response, starting before the 2019-20 school year, the state just introduced a bonus policy. If you teach in a special education position, you get a $10,000 bonus. And that policy has been in place for the past 3 years. There's also additional bonuses for teaching in hard-to-staff schools that I'm not going to talk about here. Perhaps not surprisingly, when you're increasing base pay by about 20%, teachers were much more likely to go into those positions. You see a sharp decline in the proportion of special education positions that are vacant or filled by an unlicensed teacher. we can estimate models that show that this effect is likely causal in the sense that you didn't see a similar decline for general education positions. But related to my question from the beginning about whether this is just a shortage of special ed teachers teaching special education, it turns out that the impact of this policy was entirely driven by existing teachers moving back into special education positions, not actually retaining special education teachers at higher rates. So I think that raises some interesting questions for the field that I'm certainly happy to talk about either in discussion or as part of the Q&A. I can monitor the Q&A box. But that's an example of a state effort to improve retention.
Roddy, not to interrupt, there is a question in the chat, and it says, Roddy, does staying in means staying in the classroom teacher position and not moving to like an admin role or specialist role, or what? How is it defined here?
That's a great question. In the figure I showed for Washington, if you moved into a special education administration position, you were called leaving the workforce. That's teachers' first 3 years in the workforce. So that kind of move would be really unlikely. It's a bigger, not problem, it's a bigger factor later in teachers' careers. So in an effort to hand off, I would just note that there's kind of 3 big things I haven't mentioned at all. One is I haven't talked at all about special education teacher effectiveness, which I think is really important. A second thing I haven't talked about is teacher working conditions. A common reaction to this finding is, it's great to pay people more, but what about the conditions in which they're working? And a third point is I didn't talk about any specific aspects of special education teacher preparation that may predict these later outcomes. And fortunately for all of you, those are the topics of the next 3 presentations. So with that, I'd invite questions in the chat or feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to hand it off for our next presenter.
So we have about 1 minute. We're ahead of time. So if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And if not, we'll move forward with our next presenter, Dr. Allison Gilmore.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. So today I'm going to pick up on a couple threads that Roddy did a nice job of setting up for me around teaching quality, and also this idea that we have teachers who could be special educators, but they're not. So we'll talk more about that. In general, we think about teacher turnover as a negative thing. It's likely not good for students when their teachers leave the classroom. However, there's evidence from general education research that thinking about who leaves or moves is actually really important. Researchers have consistently found that the less effective teachers actually have the higher probabilities of turnover. And sort of the theory of change here is that if the least effective teachers are leaving teaching, then their replacement is likely to be average and better than the person who is there, and that could be really good for student achievement. But researchers have also found that the most effective general education teachers tend to have really high rates of moving between schools. So they're moving from schools with less desirable working conditions to more desirable working conditions. And this can actually exacerbate inequities in access to effective teachers. Now, none of these studies have thought about special educators, and special educators have an additional element that's important to consider when we're thinking about turnover or movement, and that's movement to general education. So older estimates of the extent to which special education teachers move to general education are actually quite high, 5 to 10% depending on the year. But these are data from the 90s and early 2000s, and we generally haven't thought much about this movement to general education. Additionally, the potential effects on students here is unclear. There's evidence in general education that churn within a school, so a teacher who changes grades or subjects, their students tend to have lower academic outcomes. But we could imagine that a former special education teacher, now teaching general education, that could actually be really great for students with disabilities who are educated in a general education classroom. So we don't know a lot about these teachers, and we don't know the extent to which We have special educators switching to general education, and we have very little information overall about if teaching quality is associated with teacher movement for special educators. So, I'm missing a question. Mia, can you go back 2 slides? Thank you. So my question for you is going to be, how do you think about teaching quality in special education? So I'll just pause for a second and see what you say. Not a lot of responses, because it actually turns out measuring teaching quality in special education is hard. Yeah, someone said students making effective progress. Definitely, that would be our ideal. Anyone else have ideas? Okay, so we have kind of 2 imperfect ways that people tend to measure teaching quality. So the first is using value-added scores, and this attempts to get at exactly what Meredith said in the chat, the extent to which students are making progress. But value-added scores attempt to isolate the test score contributions of individual teachers. This is really hard to do for general education teachers too, because we can only get value-added scores when a teacher teaches in tested subjects and grades. For special educators, there's additional challenges to having value-added scores. The special educator needs to teach enough students who participate in the regular state assessment to even be able to estimate these scores. And then other components are that a student's goals that they're working with a special education teacher on may not be directly related to the state assessment, or a student's achievement may be so far below grade level that they're making great progress, but it's not captured on these state test scores. So value-added scores have some tricky elements for all teachers and then some specific challenges for special educators. On face value, observation scores, such as those used in evaluation systems across the country, appear to be a better way to measure teaching quality. They manage to address aspects of teaching that may not be captured in test scores, but are still important, and they're available for all teachers. However, the challenge here is that most of the rubrics that are used in practice, except in a couple states, assume a very single definition of effective teaching that may not actually align with what we would think of as effective special education instruction. A nice example of this that my colleague Nate Jones uses is that on the Danielson framework for teaching, there are many elements about promoting classroom discussion amongst students. If you're a special educator working one-on-one doing direct reading instruction, there aren't a lot of opportunities there to be assessed on how well you're promoting group discussion, and really promoting group discussion might not be an appropriate use of time. So we have a misalignment between the rubrics we use and what special education teaching quality actually should look like. So these are our 2 imperfect ways of measuring teaching quality, but they are what is used in practice and policy, and they may have consequences for special educators, particularly around their decisions to stay in their schools. Let me see, it's not moving forward. Mia, can you move it forward for me? Thank you. So the research question for this study is, what is the association between teaching quality, measured by these 2 imperfect, but the best we have measures, and special educator turnover after accounting for teacher, classroom, and school characteristics? So I addressed this question using data from Tennessee. I saw there was at least one person from Tennessee here. Their administrative data across 5 years, using that last year to calculate turnover, so 4 years of data. And I used 3 different samples of special educators. The first is all special educators in the state. And this is to get a general sense of what turnover and movement to general education looked like. Then I have a reduced sample of special educators who are linked to students and have value-added scores. This is a much reduced sample for many of the challenges I addressed earlier. You have to have tested grade, tested subject, and enough students to have a stable score. Additionally, there's 1 year of state test score data that wasn't usable because of statewide testing issues. And then finally, I look at special educators who are linked to students and have observation scores. And again, this is about it's a reduced sample of about half the special educators in the state. I see someone in the chat said every year you struggle with what to do for special education teacher evaluations. I don't think you're alone. And I think that explains part of why there is this reduced sample when we're looking at special educators with observation scores. They're just not getting observed. So I addressed my research question using a variety of different statistical models. The things to keep in mind here is that the dependent variable is moving within district, moving between districts, or leaving teaching in the state. And then I also look at switching to general education. Okay, so first let's just look at some descriptive results about turnover in Tennessee over these 4 years. So about 83% of special educators stayed in their school. So they remained teaching in their school. 7.4% moved within their district to another school. 2.3% moved across districts to another school. And then 7.4% of special educators left teaching in the state. 8% of the teachers who stayed in their school or moved between schools, either within or across district, switched to general education. Let's dig into those general education teachers a little bit more. So of teachers who stayed in their same school, about 7% switched to general education. So they're in their same school, but they went from a special education position to a general education position. Those who moved within district, about 18% went from a special education position to a general education position at another school. And then moving between districts, 28% of the teachers who moved between districts went from teaching special education in one district to teaching general education in another district. Let's get into the results looking at teaching quality and turnover. Value-added scores were associated with special educators leaving teaching in Tennessee. It was not associated with moving within district or moving between district. And this association was such that teachers with higher value-added scores were less likely to leave teaching in Tennessee. So teachers with lower value-added scores were more likely to leave teaching in the state. Observation scores were associated with each different type of turnover in terms of movement. So teachers with higher observation scores were more likely to move within their district. Teachers with higher observation scores were more likely to move between districts, and teachers with higher observation scores were more likely to stay in teaching in Tennessee. So teachers with lower observation scores were the most likely to exit versus teachers with higher observation scores. Looking at switching to general education, there wasn't an association here with teaching quality. So what can we take away from this? The first is our past estimates and many of the current estimates coming out of special educator turnover may actually be underestimations, which is a little worrisome. The overall turnover rate when we considered the teachers who stayed in their schools but switched to general education was almost a quarter of special educators. So 23% of special educators were turning over. This is a lot of teachers, but it's also really interesting to think about these switchers. And this is a point that Roddy brought up really nicely. This is a potential pool of teachers who could be teaching special education. And we need to think about why they're leaving and what we could do to either keep them in special education or pull them back into special education. One result I didn't present here is that dual certified teachers, so teachers with a general education and a special education certification, had a 68% increase in their odds of switching to general education. And they are 39% of the sample. So we have a lot of teachers who are moving from special education to general education, and potentially policies around dual certification could exacerbate that movement. And so that's something to think in mind when we're trying to address shortages and design policies that keep special educators in the classroom. Another element I'd like you to consider, and I'd be curious to see what you think in the chat, is why do special educators with lower scores leave? So to remind you of the beginning of this presentation, The theory of change kind of saying like, oh, some turnover is good, is that we're getting rid of the less effective teachers and they're being placed by more effective teachers. But we have to keep in mind that the scores special educators receive, particularly on their observation scores, may not accurately represent their special education teaching quality. There's evidence in general education that getting a low observation score can actually cause general educators to leave teaching. And it would be very worrisome if special educators are leaving teaching because they got a poor score and it doesn't actually reflect their special education teaching quality. So this is another example of how other policies going on within our state, within our district, could potentially influence our ability to retain special educators. And then my last question that I'd love to hear what you think of, and that is kind of an uncomfortable question, is a low quality, as measured by these imperfect measures of teaching quality, is a low quality special educator better than no special educator? There's data from the national level that 45% of schools report special educator vacancies. So unlike general education, we don't have these other teachers of average ability that are just waiting to replace those who leave. And so we really need to think about, how do we develop the teachers we have and ensure they have the conditions to be effective special educators to improve outcomes for students with disabilities? Thank you.
Excellent presentation, Allison. And we have about 2 more minutes. If you don't mind dropping in the chat, is a low quality special educator better than no special educator? There's thoughts on building knowledge and capacity with what we have, those that are low quality, but what are your thoughts on that? I think that poses a really compelling question. Okay, with that, we're going to pass it on to Dr. Elizabeth Bettini. Oh, sorry, here's one question real quickly. It says, or at what point high quality special educators cease to be effective if their caseload is too high? So that's an excellent point. So our teachers are asked to be teachers, attorneys, write all this legal paperwork. Excellent question. Okay, we're tight on time, so now I'm going to pass it to Liz. Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, Stacey. It's really a pleasure to be here with you guys, and really, wow, hard to follow those 2 prior presentations. So thank you guys so much. So I'm going to be talking about improving working conditions to improve retention. I just want to briefly acknowledge that the work I'm sharing was supported by the Institute of Education Sciences and the Spencer Foundation, and we're grateful for their support. So you guys heard from Roddy and Allie about the important role that attrition plays in special education teacher shortages. My colleague Bonnie Billingsley and I conducted a systematic literature review in 2019 of 30 studies published since 2020 that looked at factors shaping special education teachers' attrition and intent to leave their jobs. And the most consistent and robust finding across those 30 studies was the importance of working conditions in shaping special educators' desire to be in their jobs and to stay in those jobs over time. And I see that reflected in some of your guys' comments on the questions that were posed earlier. So when we talk about working conditions, what do we mean? What exactly are working conditions? I think everyone kind of has their own image in their mind of what that term means. And typically we use it to mean 2 things. So we use it to mean the balance between the demands that are placed on folks, so the responsibilities they're assigned as part of their job, and the resources they're provided to meet those demands. And for special educators, demands include a whole bunch of things. So, their instructional responsibilities. Rebecca Zumeta-Edmonds was alluding to their caseload characteristics. The students who they're assigned to teach within a particular instructional group. People often talk about paperwork, any kind of extra demands like bus duty. And importantly, demands aren't bad, right? Teachers get into teaching because they want to provide instruction. They want instructional responsibilities. So demands are part of what's most motivating about the job for special education teachers. But they need to be well matched with the resources that folks are provided to meet those demands. And so those resources include the social resources, such as their administrator support, paraprofessional support, the school culture. Their logistical resources, so the practical tools they need to get the job done. For example, if you have more instructional responsibilities, you may need better quality and more extensive curricular materials and more planning time to plan for those instructional responsibilities. And then finally, informational resources. So information about how to become a better teacher, how to continue improving your practice over time. So what we find often in our research with special education teachers is that there is often not a balance between the demands placed on folks and the resources they have to meet those demands. So I want you guys to all reflect for a moment. I think we've all had times in our life that have felt this way. What does your work life look like when your demands and resources are out of balance? So take a moment to reflect on that in the chat. So folks are saying they feel discouraged, they cry, low tolerance for frustration, feeling overwhelmed, general sense of hopelessness, stressed. I mean, a lot of the things that you guys are sharing are the very similar things that we hear from teachers. So teachers will share that they begin triaging responsibilities. So they'll do things like say, I am going to plan really carefully in reading, but I am going to just open the book in math and do whatever is next in the curriculum. Or I'm going to teach Johnny really carefully and plan his lesson really carefully because I know he's really struggling. And I'm going to put Joey on a computer and have him work independently. We've heard teachers describe really pretty challenging triaging that they're engaging in when making decisions about what demands to fulfill. We also see teachers have told us that it results in lower quality instruction, and we see that in our work, and I'll share some examples in a little bit. So when they're not planning as well, when they don't have time to provide the quality of instruction that they need, that the instruction does tend to suffer. Over time, that's very stressful, as you guys are alluding to in the chat. It doesn't feel good to provide bad instruction to your students. And that chronic stress eventually leads to burnout and eventually attrition. So for example, one teacher we were working with, she was teaching 4 grade levels. She was responsible for teaching all subjects to all 4 grade levels. She did not have a plan time because her students went to specials at different times every day. And so she said, you know, my planning is always in the moment. I open the book that day and go, all right, what are we going to learn today? Because I don't have any prepping time. And if I did careful prep for all 4 grade levels, I'd be sitting there after school until 6 o'clock. And she talked about how the previous day she had done careful prep and she was really burning herself out and thinking about quitting. So she decided not to do that anymore. But then that had big consequences for her instruction. We could see that. We have videotapes of her instruction. Her lessons were not very coherent, as you would expect when someone's just kind of opening the book. And she didn't feel great about it. Another teacher shared, I end up feeling like I'm never really doing my job and I'm always letting the kids down. And this teacher, when she said that, was crying and actively looking for other jobs. So it has really big consequences. And this shows up both in the ways that teachers talk about their work. It also shows up in some of our quantitative work. So just as one example, we conducted a national survey of special educators teaching students with emotional and behavioral disorders. We found that working conditions explained 65% of the variance in their emotional exhaustion, which is a component of burnout, and 58% of the variance in their intent to leave their jobs. The working conditions that were most strongly related to those outcomes, number one was their planning time, and we see that really consistently across all of our work, that when folks feel like their planning time is adequate, they feel better about their jobs overall, more likely to plan to stay. Second was their instructional grouping, so the extent to which they felt like they were assigned groups of students and instructional responsibilities that were manageable within a particular class period. The adequacy of their curricular resources. It is astounding to me how often special educators are not given the curricular resources that are given to the other teachers in their school. And then finally, their administrator support. And importantly, administrator support also predicts their ratings of those other working conditions. The effects of these working conditions on their emotional exhaustion and intent to stay is mediated by the perception that their workload is manageable. So what that means is when they have these conditions in place, they feel able to manage their workloads and subsequently are less likely to experience emotional exhaustion and burnout. And importantly, these are also the conditions that a growing body of research finds are really important for instructional quality. So when folks have those conditions in place, they tend to provide higher quality, more systematic instruction to their students. So we've been finding this across, I could go through one study after another where we're consistently finding strong relationships between working conditions and various outcomes. And what that raises for us is the question, all right, so how do we improve working conditions, right? So if we know that working conditions are impacting all of these outcomes, what can we do about it? So what we've started to do as a team is try to dig into what are the roots of the problem. So we see challenging working conditions on the surface. What's going on underneath that is leading to those challenging conditions? And so there's a couple of things that we're finding in our qualitative work that seem to be really important. So the first is that the school as a whole is oriented towards non-disabled students. The school schedule, curriculum purchases, et cetera, are all oriented with the assumption that a typical learner is the primary aim and objective of the school structure and organization. So what that means is that special educators are consistently having to work against the grain of how their school is organized in order to meet their students' needs. So just as a simple example, if you order a curriculum that is not universally designed, that means that the special educator who's teaching students who don't have access to that curriculum is constantly having to backwards design that curriculum to get their students access to it, which is a lot more work than simply being able to use the curriculum. And then undergirding that, so that teacher's having to go above and beyond, and their need to go above and beyond is being supported by what we're calling the sacrificial teacher narrative. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like. So we were in a school with a self-contained program for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. The teacher in that school, her pseudonym is Hannah. She was very hardworking. She was coming to school every morning well before the kids, staying well after they were gone every night. She was teaching 3 grade levels, all subject areas with no planning time whatsoever. And she was a great teacher in the morning, and she was not a great teacher in the afternoon. By the end of the day, she was really tired and she was getting pretty snappy with her students. And we could see this in her instructional quality scores. So towards the end of the day, her classroom management scores were diving down as she wasn't as emotionally responsive. So we interviewed her principal about why she wasn't getting planning time. And so he said, teachers by contract, you get a prep every day of planning time. Oftentimes with these little cherubs, that planning time doesn't work out, right? So that's something I struggle with because of the difference between the kids. The barriers are really the kids. And oftentimes their needs are very different than the needs of a child in a mainstream classroom that can go into another room and not have any issues, right? That's not always the case, especially with the relationships that they've built with these children. Those relationships don't always carry over to other adults, right? So you may have to give up some of that planning time, your lunchtime, to be there for that child. And I don't think the special educators would give that up. I've even asked them, do you have to take no, I'm not going to leave my child over here struggling because I need a planning time. So we see here a couple of things. So the teacher has no planning time. There's an assumption that the reason she doesn't have any planning time is because of a problem with the kids, as opposed to a problem with the supervision that's provided during her planning time, with the structure of how students are supervised. So there's no one available to go with her students to specials, no one who has the skills and expertise that she has. So rather than thinking of this as a structural problem, the principal's thinking of this as a student problem. And then finally, there's this sacrificial teacher narrative. She's a good teacher. She wouldn't give up, giving up her planning time. She wants to give up her planning time for her kids because she's a good teacher, right? And we can be pretty hard on Howard, and in our papers, we are pretty hard on Howard. But the truth is we hear this from teachers as well. So we were sharing with some teachers our work about the importance of planning time. It was a group of teachers who also were not getting it. And we asked them about barriers to getting planning time. And one of them said, I often feel like I have to check my needs at the door. I just can't think about myself until the kids are gone. And her colleague replied, and if you're not comfortable with that, then this is the wrong job, right? So we know that they need planning time to be more effective teachers. And yet there's this idea that if they're not willing to sacrifice that, they're a bad teacher, right? And so that's a barrier to thinking about improving their working conditions. They were really resistant to the idea that they should implement some kind of intervention to get better planning time. So I want you guys to just take a moment and reflect. How have you seen that narrative show up in discourses about teachers' work in your own contexts? Go ahead and share in the chat. Yeah, so we see this showing up in discourses in the popular press. We see it showing up, teachers talking to one another. We see it showing up with administrators. Hey, good teachers should be willing to sacrifice. So what do we see in places where there are more positive working conditions? A couple of things. One, the school structure is oriented towards all learners, and teachers are treated as professional workers. And when we see those things in place, we typically see leaders who are engaged in regular interactions with special education teachers about their work. The teachers are empowered to communicate with leaders about challenges they're experiencing. And challenges that teachers experience are assumed to be rooted in structural problems, not teacher problems or student problems. So I'll give you an example. We were working with a rural school district in Arizona, and there was a special education teacher in that school who worked with students who were in transition services. And so a lot of what she was doing was facilitating community-based experiences, job placements, things like that. And she was spending a tremendous amount of time every day on transportation paperwork. So she'd come in every morning, she'd fill out transportation paperwork, she'd call transportation, try to make sure that the van's that's supposed to pick up Johnny knows where it's supposed to go, that it's the bus driver who gets along with Johnny, right? Just trying to make sure that transportation was set up for all of her students. And it was occupying a lot of her time. And then sometimes there were miscommunications and her students weren't getting the transition services they were supposed to get. So she said to her assistant superintendent, if I could just get a van, can we just get a van? And so rather than saying like, hey, this teacher needs to be more efficient, or, this teacher just isn't working hard enough, they were like, hey, actually, like if you're using transportation every single day, maybe you should have a van dedicated to your class, right? So the material for positive working conditions was materials for transition services, a van for her class. It was a purchase order that was, maybe not typical to buy a van for one teacher, but it was oriented towards the needs of the students that she was serving. And there was an assumption here that it wasn't that she was inefficient or that the transportation folks were being ineffective, but rather that the system wasn't set up to support the needs of her students in her class. And so they made systemic change and then rolled that out across the entire district, benefiting the transition services across the whole district. So what we've been taking from this is that this is primarily a qualitative body of research. We're starting to move into other ways of looking at it. But the two big things that we're thinking about are that we need systemic mechanisms to identify problems teachers are experiencing with their working conditions. And then we need structural solutions that can help us to resolve those across entire districts and communities. And I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Liz. Continue to drop your thoughts in the chat and put your connections and reflections in the Jamboard. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Melinda Lecco.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here, and I will be rounding out this first panel. And I have to say, I have enjoyed the time already listening to Liz, Allie, and Roddy. My presentation will focus on that preparation side and really looking specifically at how to center practice into our special education teacher preparation arenas. So teaching is a practice-based profession. And so if you think about that, in order to get better, you need opportunities to practice. When I need to, take off on an airplane, I'm really hoping that that pilot has had a lot of opportunities to practice flying that plane before I board. Similarly, if I need to undergo surgery, boy, do I hope that surgeon has practiced whatever the procedure is. And sometimes historically, we haven't always thought about teaching in this practice-oriented kind of way. But in order to really help support students with disabilities, we need to start setting teachers up for success through preparation that is very grounded in practice that we know helps move the needle from them being novices to more experts. But we really need to, I think, dissect this word practice and start being more precise with what that means. So there's the adage, practice makes perfect, but that's not always the case. It depends on the quality of the practice. You can practice something really horribly and get worse. That is true for me in many sports. But we want to focus on helping teachers have high quality practice so that they get better. And decades of research has shown that high quality practice centers on these 4 attributes. It has to be cohesive. So there has to be an appropriate scope and sequence. We wouldn't ask someone to start practicing something that's more complicated than they're ready for. We want the practice to be very focused on the most essential skills and not random. When you are, perhaps you've helped a child or a loved one learn how to drive. In the beginning, we're not teaching them how to change the radio. We really want that practice to be focused on those essential skills, like can you brake? Can you put the car in drive? And so we really want practice for teachers to be similarly structured, that it's focused on the most essential skills in the proper order. We also know that as people gain expertise, it's due to having repeated opportunities to practice things over again. Usually you don't practice something once and you're now the expert. And we want it to be deliberate. And by deliberate, we think about 3 elements. In deliberate practice, people have really good models. So this is when they need to see what the good practice looks like. What does it look like to have a really high quality IEP meeting? What does it look like to have excellent classroom management skills for students? Then individuals actually need to try the practice and get feedback on it. How did they do? We talk about, Allie had some great points about instructional quality through observation instruments. People need to get feedback on what they're actually doing. And then finally, we need people to take ownership of their own learning in terms of becoming effective in reflection and analysis. So they need to try something, think about how it felt, how they thought they did, and what they might do differently in the future. So what I'm going to share today is the result of several comprehensive literature reviews that my colleagues and I have conducted to try to identify which practice-based pedagogies hold the most promise for novice teachers. I say novice teachers because that can include both pre-service teachers who might be going through a very traditional educator prep program. I saw we have lots of individuals representing those contexts, but it can also be teachers who are new to the profession. And as we have talked about through the other presentations, you might have someone in a special education position that has entered the field with little to no upfront preparation. So what I'm going to be sharing today will be things that can hold true and be effective for really those teachers at these beginning stages where we want them to become more expert in their craft. And so based on our reviews of the literature, we've identified 5 pedagogies that really anchor teachers' practice in ways that help them do those things that were considerations of deliberate practice. So it gives them opportunities to have models, to get feedback, and to engage in reflection and self-analysis. And so some of these, probably are very familiar terms to you, but I just put a quick description of what I mean. So simulations is this idea of imitation or role playing in a controlled setting. I think more and more when people hear the word simulation, they automatically think of what we refer to as mixed reality simulation, things like Immersion, Teach Live, where you're up in front of these really cool avatars. But it can also be more low tech pedagogies, such as micro teaching, where you might have 2 teachers role play, one being the teacher, one being the student, and trying out different instructional routines. Video analysis would be someone watching video recorded instruction and analyzing the practice. They could be watching a master teacher who's very, very competent at a particular skill, but they could also self-record their own instruction and analyze it. Tutoring is the idea that a teacher would provide small group intervention or instruction to P12 students. Coaching is the idea that someone is going to engage in instruction and then receive performance feedback from an expert. And finally, lesson study is the idea of collaborative planning, instruction and analysis of student learning with other teachers in a group setting. Across all of these pedagogies, we have quite a bit of research that signals these pedagogies improve special ed teacher candidates' knowledge, self-efficacy, and most importantly, their actual practice. And the reason I bring this up is, as you know, at the very beginning, Roddy asked of the attract, prepare, retain, where are people feeling the rub? And, you know, I was actually happy to see nobody said preparation per se. But what I would challenge everyone to think about is, how can we make the preparation time that we have with individuals the most effective? Because again, if you are at an educator prep program, you might have less than 2 years to work with a candidate. If you are a local school district administrator and you've just hired someone on, you know, whatever your state calls an emergency or provisional license, they're already in front of students without having really upfront high quality preparation. So I would just say that it sounds like people are doing a great job with preparation, but I think we can always improve our efforts by making sure what we are asking candidates and new teachers to do is not only going to help in their effectiveness, but it's also going to be time efficient, because we just don't have 10 years with people in order to help build their expertise. So just quick in the chat, go ahead and put there, which of the 5 that I just described might work well in your context, or maybe some of you have already tried some of these and found some of them to be particularly helpful. So take just a minute and let us know what you have been thinking about in terms of these pedagogies. Nice. I'm seeing a lot of coaching, which would make really great sense, but also video analysis, simulation. Excellent. Good. Now, one of the things to think about with these 5 pedagogies is that we can think about them on a continuum, moving from more controlled type practice opportunities to more authentic. And essentially what that means is, in a more controlled setting, it might be in a college course class or in a standalone PD where you're not necessarily having teachers interact with P12 students. So it's more controlled in that there's less variability. As the teacher educator, you can really control the variables that you're asking teachers to focus and practice. It requires fewer resources because you don't necessarily need to have an established partnership with a school district, or you don't need to have a novice teacher being observed and coached by a more veteran person, which, as we know, when we have shortages, sometimes it's hard to find those veteran mentors to step in and help. But as things are more controlled, the trade-off there is that sometimes the practice that we can provide teachers is less complex than what their normal everyday demands will be, and sometimes is more limited to discrete skills. On the other end of the continuum, we have pedagogies that are situated in very authentic settings. You know, coaching someone while they're teaching is in a P12 setting is very authentic. Doing lesson study where they're collaboratively planning with other teachers is very authentic. So this is really great, you know, opportunities to provide teacher candidates and novice teachers. It supports more complex teaching practices because they're actually engaging in the full range of instructional demands that they would have when they are in front of P12 students with disabilities. However, it can require more resources as we you know, think about the personnel demands that it might require. And it can also require more partnerships between educator prep programs and P12 settings. So the idea here is not that one of these pedagogies at one end or the other is better or worse. It's always about trade-offs. And sometimes I think the best solution is to have a combination. You might not always have a coach who's right there ready to step in and help a teacher. So could you supplement that coaching with video analysis where someone is watching really great teaching and dissecting and analyze what they're seeing? The point that I just want to make is, again, we have limited time with our new teachers. And so it's really helpful, and the research supports the idea that we need to move in more practice-based ways of preparing teachers. And the 5 pedagogies that I've shared have research that shows they are effective. And again, depending on your own context, you can choose ones that are more controlled and less demanding in terms of implementation, or ones that are more authentic and will help move the needle on preparing teachers to help kids with disabilities make progress. So just as I wrap up this first panel, as you're thinking about, which pedagogy would you choose, what's most important to you in how you would make those decisions? And then I'm going to take a minute to look at the chat. Yeah, the Teach Live can really help novice teachers feel more comfortable. And wondering about the value of teaching coaches and supervisors to have productive feedback. Yes, absolutely. Again, high quality practice is what's important, not just practice. So that includes the level of quality of feedback that people are receiving. And I think with that, Stacy, I turn it back to you because I'm super excited to hear from Georgia. I've kind of been waiting all day for this, so.
Thank you, fantastic. I first want to thank our first panel of presenters. Thank you, Drs. Gilmore, Bettini, Theobald, and Lecca. Well done. Thank you so much. So now we're going to shift gears just a little bit to our second presenter powerhouse that will target retaining special education personnel at all levels, Georgia's approach. So these 4 presenters, they continue to build knowledge and capacity across the state of Georgia by promoting recruitment, preparation, and retention for educators supporting students with disabilities. So first up on the far left is Lynn Holdide. She is a senior advisor for the GTL Center and serves as a director of strategy for the Cedar Center. Or, I'm sorry, at GTL Center and the Cedar Center. Next up is Winna Lowe. She is a state director for the Georgia Department of Education. Next is Dr. Kathy Johnson. She is a program manager for the Georgia Department of Education. And on the far right, you'll see Amy Copo. She is technical assistance consultant for both the GTL Center and also the Cedar Center. So I'm going to hand it to the Georgia team.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Before I turn it over to Winna and Kathy, who are your main presenters today, we just wanted to give you a little bit of context as to how the impetus for this work and how it got started. So if you can go to slide 78, Mia, the induction. I know you've talked a lot already about the educator workforce and shortages. So we're going to kind of dive into how Georgia has used induction as a retention strategy. So we know that years of research support the need for mentoring and induction. The quality of induction for new special educators is a powerful predictor of their intention to stay in schools. Especially for new teachers. We're seeing a lot of teachers now that have done alternative certification and haven't gone through 4-year programs. So that just-in-time support and then induction support is more important than ever. And practitioners have indicated that strong mentorship and induction in early career has been one of the most effective methods of improving teacher retention. Research from NTC suggests that mentor selection, professional development, and support are key elements of mentoring and induction programs that lead to their success. Ongoing support for beginning teachers is needed, and specific guidance strengthening teacher practice is foundational to mentoring success. Georgia has taken this research to heart in the model, as they will describe in a moment. But also included here on this slide is a link to the GTL Center's Mentoring and Induction Toolkit. This is a free resource that can be used to help districts design mentoring and induction programs. So we encourage you to check that out, as well as the other universal resources on the GTL website. So as articulated earlier, the challenges in the educator workforce occur across the career continuum, meaning that the state education agencies, districts, and ed prep programs all have a role to play in strengthening the workforce. Georgia is an excellent example of a state that has taken a comprehensive approach. I love working with them. I'm very grateful to work with them through the Teacher Provider Retention Program, as well as on CEDAR. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Winnow and Catherine Johnson to talk more about Georgia's Teacher Provider Retention Program.
Thank you, Amy. We are excited to be here today, and I loved listening to all the research. And I think as you go along through our presentation, you'll see that most of those research findings are exactly what we found out too. And part of the reason that we have addressed this retention concern from a lot of different angles. So as most of you remember, the graphic that you see was an initiative by former OSEP director Lori Vanderplug. And, you know, we were beginning to feel a lot of effects of the teacher shortage. Of course, special education teachers are always the largest shortage area. That has just historically been the case. But we found that we had about 3,400 jobs each year that were going unfilled. And so that brought around the interest for applying for one of the 325 grants through OSEP when it became available in the summer of 2020. Now, let me frame that a little bit. Most of you remember we were shut down in March 2020. So everybody was still pretty much at home. Things were not back to normal. But near the end of June, this grant opportunity was released. I got a call from our state director at the time, Dr. Smith-Dixon, and she said, you know, I think we're ready for something like this. You know, can you lead this and get the grant written and submitted? And of course, I said, of course we can, you know, Zell, that's what we needed to do. But we really already had so many pieces in place. So we did apply for the grant for Part B and C. We do not have a C in the Department of Education. It's separate in community health. Of course, community health was a little tied up at the moment because of the pandemic, and they didn't feel like they could apply on their own. So we applied on their behalf. And so we have both Part B and C of this grant that we share. So we were awarded the $500,000. We just got our continuation funding for the 4th year at the full award too. And if you can move to the next slide. Of course, we found in examining our data, we had about 3,400 vacancies that went unfilled. We also found that between 2018, 2020, the data that we were examining to prepare for this grant, that we'd hired a little over 1,200 teachers. We were losing the same amount each year. So a large portion of our workforce is turning out to be within their first 3 years of the teaching career. Okay, we're ready to go to the next. So one of our regional directors reached out to me. She saw the grant opportunity at the same time. They were operating in Georgia. Our alternative certification program is done through the regional support networks that are funded across the state to bring it down to a more personal level with our LEAs. So with this large TAP provider over in West Georgia, she gave me some data that further made me realize exactly what we needed to do. About half of the TAP candidates, about half of the candidates in TAP each year are for special education. That makes sense because special education has the most vacancies. So you're bringing in a large group of folks to teach in special ed classrooms that are not teachers. They've not been prepared to teach. They've not been prepared to teach special education. But yet we have in most cases, our most fragile group of students that need the very best prepared teachers that we can have. So no wonder that without support and good preparation, that they don't stay very long in the classroom. But the data showed across the state of Georgia to the TAP providers that almost every teacher that receive their certification in special education through this alternative certification program left by the end of year 1, or at least by the end of year 2. So if we could just, as some of the research showed earlier, keep the people that we have, that could make a big difference to us. So that is kind of the premise that we started out as we began to apply for this grant. But let me back up just a little bit more. In 2014, Georgia became a CEDAR state. We have been very blessed by the work of CEDAR. I think that this grant probably made us realize it more than ever. We have collaborated on so many projects with our CEDAR partners. CEDAR is able to bring the ed prep providers together, the Department of Education, as well as our Professional Standards Commission, our certification arm, which is outside of either of those agencies, and to work on initiatives that really all led up to this work. As HLPs were introduced, 2 of our ed prep providers took this on to do videos and professional learning all throughout 2018. At the same time, we were implementing MTSS through a SPDIG grant as well, with the help of Dr. Bailey. So one of the first things that we got accomplished in 2018-19 was to get a high leverage practices hub built. So behind each oval, there are all kinds of resources that can be shared. I'm just fortunate that I said, sure, we'll house it on the Department of Education special ed website and the link through the MTSS. But actually our ed prep partners did all the work behind this. So I have to note that. And we have almost every college and university in the university system of Georgia in our CEDAR group. So we're a very active group. We don't just meet and talk about things. I always say we get things done. Next slide. So remember, we're running along, we're doing the high leverage practices, we're trying to introduce things. How do we see if we're implementing high leverage practices in special ed classrooms, especially from the SEA level? So Dr. Kate Zimmer and Dr. Melissa Driver from Kennesaw State University are active participants. They did the original videos with HLPs for this hub. And they also had a lot of interesting work going on with avatar labs through Kennesaw State University. And CEDAR gave us a small amount of money to try a pilot. And we were in the midst of beginning to do that just as we were applying for this grant kind of all simultaneously. And I wanted to see what the potential was that we could utilize the Avatar Lab in supporting special ed teachers. What could we do along the way with that? And of course, HLP work was also a natural fit there. So next slide. And again, they practice this through our regional centers. Not every regional center tried the Avatar Lab in the very first year, but a lot did. 7 or 8 out of our 18 regional centers tried that. Special ed directors tried it with scenarios built that were appropriate for them. And of course, special ed teachers also came together to work on this. Next slide. The highlights of our grant are really to provide professional learning based on high leverage practices. We added a coaching component to coach any of the teachers in the induction program. We're using mixed reality simulation. So once we do the professional learning, we're going to apply it through the mixed reality simulation. Of course, again, everything was virtual at the time, but it really wouldn't have mattered if it was virtual or not. We wanted to try this out. And again, as one of the researchers stated earlier, you need practice in a lot of different ways. You need coaching. We know that that's necessary. Next, the mixed reality simulation, we have expanded to support practice with building and district leaders, as well as new special education leaders that we run through an academy that we call CELDA, Special Ed Leadership Development Academy. And then we added an executive coach for our special education directors as well. And of course, for the Part C part, they're developing their own comprehensive personnel network. Next. You can see this visual. It doesn't include every partners, but we had a lot of heavy hitters, as I would say, if you can back up. Several of the colleges and universities have played very active roles. Kennesaw State and the University of West Georgia in particular, as well as Georgia State University. We were working with CCSSO, the University System of Georgia, our Georgia Learning Resource System, which is the special education regional network across Georgia that our office completely funds to deliver work down to the district level. So GLRS is a key component on how we deliver this work, because they're become our trainers, and then they move forward and they register new teachers, get districts to support this work. And of course, that's how it all works itself. Georgia Professional Standards was in the middle of this, as well as, of course, CEDAR and Center Great Teachers and Leaders. And we're very proud to have such a variety of partners. If we didn't have our partners, this would not have happened, because literally when I was asked about writing the grant, I think we have 4 weeks to do it. I sent out a video conference invitation and said, we got this opportunity for this grant. Everybody showed up 3 or 4 days later on a meeting. We talked about it, and everyone said, I'll take this part, and this part. I'll write it. We'll come back together in a week. And of course, I was thinking, how are these parts ever going to sound like one voice? We kind of just talked about it that afternoon, about professional learning, base it on knowledge practice, apply it through mixed reality, and eventually let's add a coaching component. And let's add an executive coach, our existing Special Ed Development Academy for special ed directors, because at that time we had turnover of special ed directors. We were turning the state over about every 4 years. So we had new special ed leadership across the state that we were constantly working with. And if you don't have strong leadership at the district level to support the special educators, there's certainly a trickle-down effect. Next slide. Can you move forward? Thank you. So you can see by this slide exactly what we do. We, again, fund a network across the state to have directors in place of our regional network. They have specialists, they have contractors that work and support that. We provide a scope of work to them along with our state priorities. They can add a few local priorities, but it is a contract with this regional center that supports special education. So to be able to reach into the classroom and provide coaching for induction level special education teachers would not be possible without our regional network. The training would not be possible without our regional network. We have a talented group of Georgia Learning Resource staff. They have been in training this week each morning on how to add year 2 to this induction program. We have a community of practice for them at least once a month. They turn around and deliver the training to the new teachers. They, of course, have the practice-based opportunities through immersion. And then we added $1.8 million to the $500,000 grant to provide coaching across the state of Georgia for all the new induction level teachers. Next. So let's go ahead and go past that. I think I've talked about most of that content there. You can see that in the first year of implementation, we based the program on 6 HLPs. So they would have a session or they would have a morning. It depended on how the regional network, how they were able to access the teachers, whether teachers were getting full day release days or it was having to be done in the afternoon or after school. But they would have the professional learning session on that particular HLP. And then maybe 2 weeks later, they would come back and apply it through simulation. So there were several different options. For the second year of the induction, which this year that we're in right now will be the first time that we've gone to a second year. They will be adding 3 additional HLPs along with some other work. Next. Okay, that tells you about the $1.8 million that we've added from discretionary funds to support the coaching. And you'll see in a few minutes some of their comments and their data, what it shows about how they feel about the coaching. Next. let's go on. That just kind of tells you the same thing that I just said. We do require coaching plans from each Georgia Learning Resource System. And this just happens to be, we had the preparation of teachers, delivery of professional learning, as well as the delivery of coaching. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Catherine Johnson, to walk you through one of the coaching plans. Okay.
Thank you. What we did this year is when we decided to add the funds for the coaching, we decided that we needed to have coaching plans turned into us at the state level since we were funding these projects. As when it was talking about GLRS, we have 18 regions in Georgia, and each of those regions has a director, which the GLRS director. So each director had to turn in a coaching plan, and it was very, it's something they've not done before. So what we did find out is that everybody had different ideas of what coaching is. So we decided that my team and I, which my team is the Instruction Systemic Improvement Unit with Federal Program Special Education, and we've just added the instruction piece on last year. So my team, if I have 14 people that work with me, decided we're going to do coaching plans. Each region turn in, at first, very brief coaching plan, as you can see on here. So what's the expectation of what they're going to do for coaching Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4? And as we're moving through these coaching plans, we're finding out the common threads that we need to make sure that everyone is participating in and using in their plans. So this is just one example. This looks like bare bones, but we also added into this is we are having monthly conversations. I have team members assigned to each of the regions, and we have conversations about what this coaching is looking like. And that's what the piece that's also important. I only came to the Department of Ed last year, and I worked 17 years at a district level in Metro Atlanta. And I was fortunate enough to actually oversee specialized teaching and learning and the assistive technology for probably about 10 years before I left and retired from the district. And what I saw is that there has to be a lot of people involved in these plans to make them work. And we saw that when we started 3 years ago with just the HLPs that, okay, we need more. Okay, well, so we have the mixed reality simulation piece of it. Well, we still needed more. And so when I came, I could see through the lens of some of the barriers and challenges at district levels, even though we were metro, a little bit different than our rural districts, but we knew that we had to have it in place where everyone knows what's going on. So what I've done is we partner with our school and district improvement folks on the general ed world side. We partner with them, and I've given them access to all of the coaching plans that we have throughout the state. I've also given them access to all of the professional learning that each of our regional GLRS directors provide to their LEAs. So what's happening is that we are on this mission, if you will, to create just unlimited communication. Everyone needs to know what we have going on. Everyone needs to know what we're doing and how we're doing it. So to be able to leverage every single resource we have for our special education students. And we are finding now that this makes a considerable difference in retaining teachers because they're finding out what actual resources are out there and what they can access on their own. So, okay, I know that Winna and everyone's looking forward to seeing some of the actual outcome results, but I really feel it's important when you see those outcomes to know the journey that we're on to get to where we're moving, even continuing to move forward. So that's why we felt it was important to let you know a little bit about our plan. We got to have a plan. Everybody has to have a plan. And to see today with the research that was shared that so many of the activities as part of this induction aligns with what is showing that works is very exciting. So Winna, I'm going to give it back over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. I saw one of the questions pop up and it said, how many people are involved in the coaching in Georgia? This morning in our training, we had 72 people. So that kind of tells you how many people are involved in the PL delivery, the mixed reality, as well as the coaching. So most all of those folks also are involved in coaching activities. And how do we get so many? The coaching is typically done through contractual agreements with retired professionals, people that have, been principals, special ed leaders, etc. Also, when I talked about the development of this grant, I was a senior program manager for the department at that time. I became director in the September of 2021. So I'm still the project manager on this grant, but I have entrusted Kathy with this. She's pretty much really the project manager behind this work. She's an excellent leader. And so this is kind of my baby. But Kathy is such a strong leader. She's doing a terrific job with it, as well as one of her specialists, Elisa Williamson. So I'm going to share some of our activities, some of our data. There are a lot of slides, so I've got to go quick on some, but I understand from Stacy that you'll have access to this information. So next. All right. Our percentage of completers for all our special education participants by grade level. We've had a pretty good response each year that we have offered this. We have around 230 LEAs in Georgia right now. The reason I'm saying around, charters change every year. We've added 8 new charters this year as well. We have 159 counties in Georgia, 21 independent city school districts still. Of course, you've got Department of Corrections, Juvenile Justice, and basically from there up to 230. So from around 183 up to 230, those are all charter districts that are in the state of Georgia. But you can see that from the completers, the majority of our participants are elementary ed teachers. Next. And the pre and post test. You can also tell the pre-test, of course, is represented in green. The middle bar, the medium blue, is the post-test, and then we show great growth from the pre to post self-assessment results with the HLPs. Next. The percentage of our participants, teacher provider retention program that we say TPRP in the agreement, are the participants in agreement that the training and coaching increase their capacity to use high leverage practices? And yes, they certainly did. You can see from the 2021-22 results, and beside it, the 2022-23 results, we're up in the 90% and higher, mainly up closer to 95%. And then it's looked at by, we have special ed teachers that have completed this program. We also have a considerable number of general ed teachers too, because that alternate CERT program that I told you about in Georgia, the TAP program, and that's TAPP, then they wanted to run their candidates through too, because they said everybody needs HLPs. Well, I was all for that, because it's not just our special ed teachers that teach students with disabilities. Hopefully our students with disabilities spend more time with the general ed teacher than they do with the special ed teacher. So you can see that the general ed teachers going through the program, either the alt cert program, or if there happened to be some that were general ed teachers prepared at the induction level, they said 100% they could use it. Special ed teachers, 95%. Next. Okay, and were they in agreement that professional learning, the training, coaching, and mixed reality influence their plans to continue teaching? And this is a very important answer to me. Again, the 21-22 results, 91%, and 22-23, 89%. And again, if you look at it divided by special ed teachers, and then the last bar, general ed teachers, 96% of the general ed teachers said it's making them plan to stay in teaching, and 88% of the special ed teachers. Next. Characteristics of the retained teachers. So of the retained teachers, 370 total participants completed one training, more than one training of the PL and the mixed reality simulation. We've only used in this analysis the teachers that were participating that were planning to be special education teachers or were prepared already to be special education teachers. So we had 14% of those that were coming through as Georgia TAP participants. We had 60% had completed the exceptional children's course, which that used to be called the Georgia course. It's just a survey course for special education of the various disabilities. 76 were employed by high need schools and 87 were certified in special education. Next. So since certification, 77% of the participants have received an initial cert within the prior 3 years. So those that were up the line with a little more experience, it was typically veterans, general ed teachers that want to be a special ed teacher. Next. And some of our analysis, special education teachers who were certified in special education coming through induction were 48% more likely to be retained than those not certified. Next. Those in TAP were 10% less likely to be retained than those that went through a different pathway. So Georgia TAP retained at 71%, and not in Georgia TAP, 81%. The exceptional children's course, that survey course that all general ed teachers, all special ed teachers, even me, this is my 41st year, I had to take the exceptional children's course because I actually was certified in middle grades education for my initial certificate. So having that 14% difference, and one of my questions to our regional networks who are the providers of this TAP program, I said, how can anybody come through to get the certification without the exceptional children's course, because it's a requirement to get a certificate? Well, with the TAP program, it's a 3-year program, and it's provided they can move the curriculum around. And so they had moved the exceptional children's course to not be taught until the end of year 2 in that preparation program. So I personally think that this data shows they need to move it back to year 1. Next. High need schools. So actually there's only a 2% difference in the teachers that were retained. If they were in a high need school, 79% retained, and not employed in a high need school, 81%. I think that also is extremely significant. And without that support, I believe it would have been a much greater difference. Next. Program completers, those that completed 75% or more of the teacher induction program, were 10% more likely to be retained than those that did not. Next. And mixed reality simulation training for administrators. So again, we had a concern about our special ed directors across the state. We wanted them to also have some additional support beyond what we call our Special Ed Leadership Development Academy. So we had scenarios designed for them to be in the Avatar Lab too, but they were set ups for difficult situations in IP meetings, difficult conversations with teachers, difficult conversations with your superintendent, because about October or November, having led part of that new director's work as a senior program manager, our new directors would come to sessions in person, burst out in tears and say, I went to my superintendent and I told him we have to offer extended school year, or I've shared we have to do this, that, and the other. We violate the law if we don't. And sometimes they get rebuffed with those situations and they didn't know how to deal with it. So we walk them through scenarios to know how to talk to a principal, know how to talk with the superintendent, parents, etc. And that's been very beneficial to them as well. Next. And so for the program, retained teachers were more likely to complete the induction program components. So the more that you completed in the induction program, the more likely that you were going to stick with it and be retained. Next. So to retain teachers, we've got many factors. To have strong teachers, we need strong leaders. We need strong leaderships to retain teachers. not just in special ed leadership, but building level leadership and district level leadership. Retaining special education directors is a priority for us, and knowledge of special education by leadership is paramount. Next. So retaining our special ed directors, as I have mentioned, we have the Special Ed Leadership Development Academy that we affectionately call SELDA. And now we have the Special Education School Administrators Academy. That's an academy that we offer to building leaders. And you're going to be shocked by some of that information. Okay, next. The Special Ed Leadership Development Academy has been around for 20 years. When I became a new director in 1997, it was a one-day meeting in Macon in the middle of the state, and they told you everything you needed to know as a new special ed director. There was no follow-up, no nothing. And so over the years, of course, we decided that we needed a very comprehensive induction program for new directors. It would be offered for 2 years. Some of our directors that finish after 2 years, they can't stand it, so they just come back for a 3rd year. And because they say that it makes more sense to them each year when they hear more about it, because by that time they've had an opportunity to actually experience some of the reporting, some of the things that typically give challenge. Maintenance of effort, that's a really hard concept for directors to understand and to explain to others about why they've got to maintain that fiscal effort. We're building capacity in the LEAs, and it's been in person primarily, 2 days a month, under some of our months, 1 day a month, in other months of the year, but we touch the new directors every month of the year, with the exception of June and, well, May and June. May because of testing and the end of school, and of course June because many of them are out of school by that time. So we have a very close relationship with the new directors, and that really has made a difference for us. Next. So to enhance the Leadership Development Academy, we decided that we needed an executive coach. You can move to the next slide. Directors need support, so they get reminders about all kinds of things. They have a district liaison assigned from our results-driven accountability unit. Everybody has their own, we call it DL. So they have somebody to reach out to that's their key contact with the department. We record our meetings now. Prior to the pandemic, we just had the in-person meetings. They were all day long. We didn't record them. And when we had to move to virtual, we didn't miss a beat. We moved straight to virtual to keep our program going. Directors would tell us how much they loved the recordings, and that they would have a 30-minute, 45-minute commute to work, and that they would just play that recording over and over again to try to, again, understand maintenance of effort or understand some of the other areas that they had never been exposed to because of not being a director previously. Next. So everybody loves SELDA training. You can see across the board, our ratings are so high. I'm so proud of that. But I realize that you don't typically have this kind of ratings from programs. And again, we do, of course, have very well-known evaluators who do a terrific job for us to measure all this and to be able to report it. Next. So competency scores, higher ratings for post knowledge to gain budget knowledge, for example. And you can see that's the largest area of gain, but you can see from their results, there is a lot of growth in each area, whether we're talking about the first year of implementation or the second. Next. And self-assessed learning gains, average 16% gain from pre to post. Next. And coaching, so the executive coaching component. This is a retired special education director. She has just left working with the department for a few years, and then decided she would love the coaching role as executive coach. And so she's coaching them. They can call day, night. She attends all SELDA sessions. They do video conferencing. And what did the director say about it? They said, as a result of the coaching, my skills as a director to support the district director of special education, that it increased it for 91% in 2021, and they said 100% said that the coaching made a difference to them. And so the next question is, it increased my skills as a special ed director or my capacity to support. So that's just the professional learning through CELDA. Again, 98% the first year said this, that we measured it, and 90% the 2022-23 year. Our 2022-23 year, we have data that we collected on questions like this to see how many teachers we retained. We won't know that until around December, because we've got to have a certified personnel inventory. But we track our teachers as well as our directors by their certificate number to see if they're still in Georgia. They can move districts, but if they're still in Georgia, that is the problem. All right, next. And just the impact on whether or not they would continue as a director of special education due to the coaching and the professional learning and support that they receive. You can see that it influenced their plans to continue as director of special ed. 98% reported 1 year, 85% the next. Next slide. And this is from the participating personnel summary, their respondents. And the participating personnel survey and other district school administrators who participated in CELDA, the purpose was to gather feedback from them. But we had 39 participants that were special ed directors and 19 that were other administrative positions. If they think they're about to have a change in director, they'll send their number 2 person to work in CELDA the year before so that they can begin to get a head start. Next. So I'm going to skip this because of time, but this is information about our executive coach. She is outstanding. And you can go on to the next slide because I want to show you the retention data. So again, this is a slide that I'm going to let you look at on your own, but they love the executive coaching. And again, the feedback that they receive, they like that, the communication, and you can see the satisfaction for 2022-23, they went straight down the line with 100%. Next. And I'm going to go ahead and skip this. It did increase their skills. They're very high scores. They rated each coaching component very high. Again, for 2022-2023, from the 91% the year before, it all goes to 100% across the board again. Next. And the participants that participate in years 1 and 2 and were retained in their position. So overall, we've got a 90% retention rate between the 2 years that we have data on at this point. We had an 86% retention rate in 2020-21, 21-22, a 96% retention rate. So that just shows you that trying to make sure that they're well prepared, that they're coached, that they have people to call. They love the executive coach because they feel like they're not calling somebody at the department to ask something that somebody might think is silly. You know, there are no silly questions, but however it works, the coach is viewed by the teachers as well as by the directors as a safe harbor that they can go to that person, and they love the coach to make a difference with them. Next. And I'm going to go ahead. We do partner with our Georgia Council on Administrators of Special Education in this induction program. And they've been great partners to us with our Special Ed Leadership Development Academy. Next. And go ahead and go to the building leaders part so Kathy can talk about that. The SEASS, go ahead. Some good support. So you've got some contact. Okay, Kathy, you can kind of bring it all home here.
Hey, I know our time is up, but if you could just indulge for a couple of
You're
minutes,
good.
is
Kathy,
it okay?
Take 5 more minutes. We want to hear from you. So
Okay, thank you,
you're
Stacey.
good. You're good.
I
We
think
want to
this
give you the
is-
space and time.
Thanks. I think this is good stuff. So what we did is you can see that we've got the induction program. We're doing the coaching. We're providing support for our directors. But we said, okay, What about the special ed administrators within the school and those general education school-based administrators? We need something for them. So what we did is created an academy is what we're calling it. It's a 19-part training series. And I have Trace Vaughn, he's actually on the call. I've been texting through this. I'm so glad he's here because he really deserves a lot of credit on this. I help oversee it, but he actually runs the program. It says a total of 305 administrators. We're actually in cohort 3 now, so that's been updated to 353 administrators that have registered for the cohort. That's amazing. And it's not only the 353 that show up, others come to these sessions that we hold, the training sessions. They don't want to commit to a cohort, but they'll still show up. So we are able to really reach out and touch so many different administrators. And as we were talking earlier about work conditions and those types of things, leaders need to know what's going on in those buildings, and they need help sometimes because they don't have those backgrounds that that you do when you're special education. We talk about what support's needed, resources, processes, what Georgia's continuous improvement is, the HLPs. And something really cool that we did is we actually aligned our sessions and said, okay, we're working on these HLPs like HLP 16, explicit instruction. Let's talk about that in one of our training series so we can make those connections. Also part of the HLP trainings in the teacher induction, there is a letter that we can send out. It's already, Cedar put it together, that goes out that we can send to principals, administrators and say, hey, these teachers in your building attended this HLP and this mixed reality simulation. Here's some follow-up guiding questions that you can ask. And I actually did that in the Metro District I worked in. It took me about 30 minutes after the sessions to do it, but it was worth every moment because that way it improves those communications. So during these sessions, we are always talking about how the communication, what we're doing, and letting these the school administrators know. What's really impressive on here, I've only got a couple of minutes, but our executive coaches that we have made over 12,000 contacts with buildings. And we're talking not sessions, just the PL series I was saying, but these are text messages, phone calls, communication with us at the Department of Education level to help these individuals when they have questions about for example, the training series or something else. Here's the alignment that I was talking about that we have for the HLPs aligned with what our training is. And here's just the example of the sessions that we hold. As you can see on here, there's many different sessions: parental rights, instructional leadership. It just goes through the whole gamut. So we're very, very fortunate that we are able to provide this. So if you have any questions or you'd like any more information, please feel free to reach out. And I have a minute, Stacy. Thank you.
That's it for us, except for the resources that you can have available. And our contact information, you'll see it along with each program, but then at the end, you'll see all of us on a slide with how to reach us. But thank you for this opportunity. We are proud of the work. We can't wait to add the data from the year that we've just ended about retention. Fingers crossed it's even higher than it was this past year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, panel number 2. And Len and Amy, I know you're there. And Winna and Kathy, thank you so much. Great work. And I can't wait to see what you do this year. And pass it to Amy Peterson. She's going to share a few Progress Center resources on supporting special education prep.
Thanks so much, Stacy, and thank you to all the presenters so far today. I've heard so much and learned so much from all of the different presenters. And thank you to all of you who are holding on. I know 2 hours of time is a long period of time. So I'll just close us up with a couple of highlights from some resources from the Progress Center. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I lead out our universal technical assistance work for the center. And you can see the website up here. It's promotingprogress.org. The resources on the center are really aligned with development, and you can see those on the next slide. That really focus on what does it take to develop a high quality educational programming, things about our IEP development, really understanding those key components of the IEP and understanding what IDEA says about those components of the IEP. We have tip sheets aligned with each of the IEP components that are up there on the website, and you'll see lots of more resources there for development. And then on the same side, you can see resources around implementation. We know that developing a high quality educational programming is not enough. We need to put that into practice, and part of that is the supporting educators to be able to do that, to have the high quality delivery of services, to ensure an environment where students feel like they belong and are engaged, that ongoing data collection and teaming and collaboration and planning, and then engagement with parents and families. So there's a number of different resources and tools available there, videos, tip sheets, resources, and so on. One of the key resources that you'll see on the next slide that is really helpful in thinking about supporting educators are a series of self-paced training modules or courses that are available through the center. These are available in a learning management system, so participants are able to get a certificate of completion for completing these. You'll see series related to special education law and some of the basics there, as well as IEP development, and then also the HLPs and some of the considerations for instructional practices that educators might need to know and to spend some time on. So each of these are about 30 minutes in length, and they really allow people to dig in a little bit deeper, learn a little bit more content, and then have some potential opportunities for real application and practice on the topics that are included in those modules. So lots of different resources there. And if you have any questions about any of those materials at any point, we're happy for you to reach out to us. We will be posting, as Stacy has mentioned in the chat, the recording for today's session, as well as the presentation materials up on the website. Those will likely take us a day or two to get all cleaned up and ready for you, but check back often for materials and resources there. On here, you'll see a QR code that we hope you will use your phones to take a second to complete an evaluation for this session today. Spend a little bit of time reflecting on what you learned, what we can do better in the future. We're really excited to hear and learn from you. I think somebody will drop a link as well into the chat, so you can click right on that for the evaluation, and you'll get that in a reminder email as well. But we would love to hear from you and hear your feedback. And then just lastly, keep connected with us at the Progress Center, and we'll keep you connected with resources from our colleagues at CEDAR and great teachers and leaders, and so many more resources from OSEP funded networks. We are on both Facebook and Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called at the moment, at K-12 Progress. We also have a mailing list newsletter that we send out announcements about center resources and events and so on throughout the year. So please connect with us, come visit our website, and don't hesitate to reach out with questions, considerations as we move forward. Thank you so much. And I think that Jamboard is also open still as you reflect on the sessions today. If you didn't have a chance already to put in some of the barriers or challenges you've been facing, or the strategies and solutions that you all have used, if you've used some of the things similar to what Georgia has put into place, or you have other suggestions for ideas for people to think about, please drop those in those Jamboards. It helps us to think about kind of what we need to do to share for the future, and we'll collect that information and use that going forward as well. So thank you for your input on those as well. So again, thank you so much. And here's our disclaimer and our contact information once again. So have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for hanging in there for 2 hours with great information. And we really appreciate all the presenters today. So thanks again.